You know, in some ways, moms have never evolved. For instance, mom would never say, "How on earth can you see this TV sitting so far back?" Or, "Yeah, I used to skip school a lot too." And moms would never say, "Just leave all the lights on. It makes the house look cheerier." Or you'd never hear mom saying, "Yeah, let me smell that shirt. It ought to be good for another week." Or, "Well, if Timmy's mom says it's okay, then that's good enough for me." And you never hear mom saying, "Well, you know, that curfew thing, it's just a general time to shoot for. It's not like I'm running a prison around here." But I think in some ways that moms have changed. A few years back, we heard about a mom that loaded her kids into the back seat of her car, strapped them into the car seat, and drove them into a lake and drowned them. And the reason was because they cramped her love life. And there's kind of a revolt against doing what it takes to be a good mom. There's even movies like Bad Moms that kind of celebrate getting away from responsibility. But that's really nothing new, because the Bible warns us in Proverbs 29:15, a child left to himself disgraces his mother. And if you don't raise them right, the truth is you'll pay later. So what's a mother to do? What's a mother to do? Now, I realize some of you will never be mothers. And obviously I've heard, and probably you have too, that if your mother didn't have any children, chances are you won't either. But the message that I have today is not only for mothers, but it's also for all of us. And if you follow these principles that I'm giving you today, then your life will be oh so much happier. It'll be full of joy and full of peace in life. This is how to find it. Well, it comes from Matthew 18, verses 1 through 5. And this is a time when the disciples were moving toward Jerusalem. They were walking with Jesus. And for the second time, Jesus begins to talk about his death. Jesus begins to talk about the crucifixion and coming up, and how he's not going to be there with them, and what a solemn time that it's going to be. And Jesus is very serious. And he looks around, and the disciples aren't even paying any attention to him. They're bickering. They're arguing back and forth about who's going to be the greatest when Jesus sets up his kingdom. And that's what they say in Matthew 8:1. Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? And in Jesus' answer, we see two characteristics that every mother should have. And in fact, every one of us should have. The first one is humility. You don't focus on yourself. Don't focus on yourself. The disciples were arguing back and forth about who's going to be the greatest. Who's going to be greatest? They're talking about political rank and authority. And it was just like Jesus to use a situation like this to teach them an awesome truth. In Matthew 18, verse 2, he called a little child and had him stand among them. And he said, "I tell you the truth, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever humbles himself like this little child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven." Whoever humbles himself. That word in the Bible means to have no status, to have no rank. It means just be an ordinary person. And Jesus calls a child and brings the child and sets it right down in the middle of them. And they were in Peter's house, we're told in another gospel. So maybe it's Peter's child. Maybe it was little Pete. In any case, Jesus, using the child as a text, begins talking about what greatness is really all about. Jesus, the greatest person in the kingdom, begins talking about what true greatness is about. And he begins by rebuking the disciples. He tells them, you're worried about being the greatest in the kingdom. You're not even going to make it into the kingdom with that kind of attitude unless what? Unless you become like this little child. And what is it like this little child? What is it about this little child? What is this about little Pete that makes him special? What does Jesus mean? Well, let's look. He's not worried about being rich. He's not worried about being popular. He's not worried about being important. In fact, he played with all the kids. He wasn't worried about what he was going to wear or even how he looked. And he wasn't quiet. The truth was, as little Pete asked questions all of the time, way too many questions. And little Pete didn't think about himself very much. In fact, he was too busy trying to find out about that world that he lived in that was still pretty new to him. And what's the key to being humble? It's not thinking little of yourselves. It's just taking the eyes off you It's not thinking about me and my problems. And you say, well, wait a minute, Pastor Bill, if you're a little kid, then you can do that. But, I have big problems. I have adult problems. How in the world is it possible for me to take my mind off of those problems? Is for me to forget about those. You can do it by depending on your Heavenly Father to provide for your needs. In the same way little Pete trusted his father to meet his needs. Some years back, we were in seminary and I was studying to be a pastor. That's what seminary is. And we lived in seminary housing with a group of other students, and some of them had little kids, and we lived in an apartment-like complex, and our house was the most popular one in the complex. And the reason for that was because we had the latest video game system. And all the kids would come up to us and play, and they'd play the video games, and the parents would come up and play. We were very popular at that time. And there was one little girl by the name of Tammy. Tammy was only 3 years old, and she would come up and play video games, and she loved it. I remember one time she was playing on a bowling game, and I would score like 150 or 160. I look over and she's like, 260. She's throwing one strike after another after another. I'm like, how does this little 3-year-old able to do that? But she was an amazing little kid, and she loved playing the video games. Well, her mom called her one day and she had to leave. So I said, okay, you got to go. And she said, okay, and started walking out the door. And I looked, and she only had one shoe on. And I said, well, where's your other shoe? And I said, I don't know, it doesn't matter. And I said, what do you mean it doesn't matter? Your mom and dad are going to kill you if you go home without shoes. And she said, no, my dad will buy me some more shoes. She wasn't worried about it at all. And that's what it's like for little kids. There's just a trust and a dependence about them. And she asked questions all the time. She'd say, what are you doing? And say, I'm making a fire. Why are you making a fire? So I can grill out. Why? So I can cook my hamburger. Why do you want to cook your hamburger? It was just one question after another. And at least 95% of those 20 million questions were not about herself, but about other things and other people. So what does it mean to be childlike? What was Jesus talking here? He's not talking about being childish. He's talking about simplicity. He's talking about living in the present. It's depending on somebody else to take care of your needs. It's no worries. It's putting it aside. Now, it doesn't mean that you don't do what you can about your problems. But what it does mean is that after you've done everything you can to fix the problems, then you just leave it to God. Trust the results to God. Now, bedtime is always kind of a rough time for kids because it really makes no sense for kids to be going to bed. After all, they're the ones with the energy left. They're the ones then when you still have hours in the day and they still have energy, they don't want to go to bed. And my children were definitely no exception to that. I remember when Catherine was very young, she had a party at school the next day. And I remember she said, I can't wait to wake up. And I thought to myself, boy, I wish that was my attitude in life. I just can't wait for tomorrow. I can't wait to wake up. She had a passion for living that couldn't wait for tomorrow to come. And her philosophy in life was kind of work hard and play God and leave the worries to your Father. And we could use a little bit more of that philosophy in our own lives because we worry way too much. And of course it doesn't help. It only makes things worse. This morning, Jesus is saying to you, forget about yourselves. Forget about yourself and just depend on me. Stop focusing on you. All the good mothers already know this, that the more you focus on you, the more miserable you'll be. It's not a trick. It's the way to find true happiness. Being a good mother not only involves, though, not focusing on ourselves, but also involves love. Live for others. In verse 5, Jesus says, and whoever receives one such child in my name receives me. That word in the Bible, receives here, means to show hospitality to. It means to take care of somebody's needs. In Jesus' day, water was very scarce, and they lived a kind of wandering lifestyle. And whenever they traveled, they were totally dependent on other people. There were no hotels to stop at. There were no Burger Kings and McDonald's along the way, no gas stations, nothing to take care of your needs. All they had was to be able to stop at a stranger's house and knock on the door. And so they were very dependent on other people when they were traveling. And help was given freely, and it was accepted freely as well. So when Jesus talked about receiving people, he was talking about looking out for their concerns, regardless of whatever inconvenience it might include. Somebody might come at 3 in the morning. They might come in the middle of the night. You may not have much in your pantry, but whatever you had, you would stop and share with them. And so Jesus uses the child in this case, again, as an example, this time to represent people in need. And that's a big category. And Jesus said, when you receive someone in my name, for my sake, not because of not for what you can get out of it, but you do it just to help them, then you are going to be blessed. In Matthew 10:42, Jesus said, if you give even a cup of cold water to one of the least of his followers, you will surely be rewarded. Jesus says it's like helping me. When you care for somebody else, you're caring for me. Jesus is telling the disciples that God is confronting you incognito in every person that you find who has a need. God so identifies us that to help somebody in need is like helping God himself. The disciples were to spend their time not worrying about their own needs and their own happiness, but they were to care for those people that they came in contact with. They were to help the other guy find happiness. They were to spend their time trying to make the other guy look good and not worrying about themselves. And in doing so, they would find what they were looking for all along, which was true greatness. And the way to find true greatness, the way to find real happiness, is to live for others. One of the best examples that I know of that was my grandmother. My grandmother loved us dearly. We would come down on vacation and she would have the whole week planned out for us. We would go to places in the morning, in the afternoons. We would go to places like the monkey jungle and the seaquarium. We'd go to all kind of fun things, to the mall. It was all focused on us all of the time. And I remember when I would leave, I loved my grandmother's strawberry shortcake. And she would make me entire cake just for me to take with me when I left. And she focused on us. She gave us her attention for that entire week. And we really loved it. And the truth was, she loved it even more. She literally lived for us. And she realized, she knew that whatever happens to your kids always comes back to you. The only thing is, whatever comes back to you is always doubled. If it's good, it comes back to you doubled. It's really good when it comes back to you. And if it's bad, as a parent or a grandparent, it comes back to you and it's doubled, and it can be really bad. But it's always what happens to your kids is going to come back to you. And God is calling you this morning to live for others. When you go to the store to get clothes, do you think about somebody else, or do you think about yourself? Do you say, wow, Catherine would look good in that? Or, when you're thinking about your grades and about school, is it, wow, I sure hope Eddie gets an A in that class? Are you concerned with you, or are you concerned with yourself? Jesus calls us to demonstrate humility by looking out for the other guy. And my grandmother was a great example of that. She dearly and deeply loved us. And it was very odd because at the end of her life, she was in the hospital. And at the same time, we were taking classes in the hospital with our first daughter. Jessica was being born. And so we were taking the birthing classes. And it was so strange because here she was. Her life was ending and the new life was beginning. And she was in the hospital for several weeks. And she was getting gradually worse and worse. And one day it became real obvious that she didn't have much longer to live. But in one particular day, right before death, she summoned all of her strength. And she did something that was unusual. She called every single one of us by name. And it's like she was saying goodbye to us. And it wasn't very long after that, maybe 30 minutes at the most, she started breathing. And the breathing became more and more difficult. And I remember she breathed, and then she stopped. And I said, Grandma, can you take another breath? She did, but that was her last. But my grandmother died knowing that she did it right. She did it right. So So my question for you this morning is, when will you find out that it's all about relationships? When you're on your deathbed? Why wait till then? Don't wait till you're at the end of your life to figure out what you're to do with your life. True joy in life always comes from not from focusing on ourselves, but for living for others, loving God and loving others. So when will you give your life for somebody else? Because that's how you find it. Happy Mother's Day.